In this lesson, we're going to go over how we can use unit tests in our Eclipse IDE for Java programming. So the first thing we need to do is to make sure to identify the class that we want to test. And in this case, we're going to test the encryptor class that we had from before. Now this encryptor class doesn't currently have anything in it, so let's add a constructor. And we'll just say public encryptor. And just to make it so that it's not just the default constructor, let's add an int for a shift or an offset for the encryptor. So we'll go ahead and save that. And then if you wanted to do a little more here, you could simply add in that variable. Then you could create the get and set methods and test those as well if you wanted to practice some testing. We're not going to go to that level here. Essentially, we're just going to cover how to go ahead and get the test set up. So there are two different ways, of course, that we can go about adding tests into our code. The first thing we can do is select the file that we're looking for, the encryptor file, and select File, New, JUnit test case. Now once we do this, it'll pop up a dialog. What we can see here is we can select either JUnit 3 or JUnit 4 tests. So we'll use JUnit 4 at this point. The name of the test class we're going to create, which is going to be called encryptor test. It'll just be the name of the file or the class that you're testing followed by test. And you can change it if you'd like. You can select default methods to stub in, such as setup before class and tear down after class, or setup and tear down, which of course would run before every test. You can generate comments if you'd like. And if you'd like to change what class you're testing, for example, if you hadn't exactly clicked on the one you wanted, you could easily browse to your specific class you want to test here. Now you could hit finish and just let it generate, but we'll go ahead and look at next so that we can see what's on the next page. Here what we'll note is that there are methods now that we can stub in for our testing. This is really handy if we have a really large class with a lot of methods in them. That way we could easily stub in those test methods without having to manually type each one. Here we have our default constructor, so let's go ahead and select that. And we have all the methods from object which we inherit, and so we're not going to test any of that at this point. You could select create final method stubs or create tasks for generated test methods. We don't need to do that, so let's just select finish. And we'll note one last thing. If this is the first JUnit test that we're adding into our project, we need to configure the build path to include the JUnit 4 library since we're using JUnit 4 testing. So we'll go ahead and select OK here. Now, if you've never done this before, you may see a dialog pop up that says, would you like to allow this to communicate? You could go ahead and select that if you're working in Windows and go ahead and allow it, and it's not really a big deal. But here what we see is that we now have our test encryptor with a fail automatically put in. It has the test set up for JUnit 4. So let's go ahead and make sure our files are all saved here. And what we can do to run this is the same thing we've seen previously. We can right-click on that test case and select Run As JUnit Test, and this will run that test and run the execution, and we should see it fail over here. We can see it fail, and of course the reason it failed is because it's not yet implemented. And then the other way we could run it is up here on this dialog that we used for running before. We could select the Run As JUnit Test, and again it will run. So there's two different ways that we can run that. The last thing I want to look at is really quickly adding a test case to an existing class. So let's just once again add a new class here, and we're going to call this Data File Manipulator. And we won't do anything special to that class at this point. And we don't really need to test this, so I'm not going to add any code at this point. But I just want to show you that you could right-click directly here and select New. And we need to browse for Other. So we need to find the JUnit wizard in here. What we want to do is we can browse down, find Java. Under Java, we could find JUnit, and then we can do a JUnit test case or a test suite. The other thing we might have been able to do up here, we might have been able to type JUnit, and very easily it will show the ones that match that. So let's go ahead and select JUnit test case. Next, and again we get the same dialog that we saw before with the same ability to select methods. And once again we now have our test stubbed in and ready to go to write our unit tests. So that wraps up our look at creating unit tests in the Java Eclipse IDE.